He was not looking for a wife, and he had long ago stopped looking for anything softer. For 12 years, Emmerich Vale let every woman who chased him wash past him like water off stone. Then a stranger, in a threadbare coat, did the one thing none of them had dared. She crossed a room full of his own soldiers and pressed into his hand the ring that had been pulled from his mother's finger the night she was murdered. He tracked her to the end of the cruelest street in the city, expecting to find out who had sent her. What he found in that freezing, gutted room instead made him call off the wedding and set fire to everything he had built to feel safe. The Verano Club had not thrown a night like it in a decade, and every soul beneath its chandeliers had come to stand close to Emmerich Vale. He held the head of the long gold room and let them orbit him, and he wore his stillness the way other men wore armor. To the guests it read as composure. It was nothing of the kind. Under the flat black of his suit, his shoulders were a wall of held tension, and the old ache had started up along his jaw, the way it always did when 300 people wanted something from him at once. The room was too warm. The champagne was too sweet. Someone had crammed every alcove full of white roses, and the roses had begun to brown at their edges and give off that heavy, Swedish, funeral smell. And Emmerich thought, not for the first time that night, that he would trade the whole glittering affair for 10 honest minutes alone in the cold. "You are terrifying the Kessler cousins," murmured Ambrose, easing up at his elbow with the unhurried ease of a man who had earned the right to stand there. 62 years old, a neat silver beard, eyes that folded into kindness for no one else in the world. Ambrose had counseled Emmerich's father before he ever counseled Emmerich. And when the whole sky had come down 12 years ago, it was Ambrose who had gathered up the pieces of a wrecked young man and taught him to reassemble into something with edges. "Smile once, for me. They think you are marrying their girl at gunpoint." "I am marrying their girl at gunpoint," Emmerich said. "The gun is only made of railways." Ambrose's laugh was low and warm, and he pressed a fresh glass into Emmerich's hand, the one liberty on earth Emmerich permitted him. "Drink! Then go stand near Delphine long enough that her father stops looking at me like I've picked his pocket." Emmerich drank. Across the floor, Delphine Kessler tipped her head back and laughed at something a senator's wife had said, the emeralds at her throat throwing off little green sparks. She was beautiful, the way certain women were beautiful their whole lives, knowingly, expensively, entirely aware of the exchange rate. She felt his glance, the way she felt everything, and turned it back to him with a small, cool smile that held no illusion in it at all. She understood precisely what this was. She had made her peace with it long before he had. He felt nothing. He had spent a dozen years teaching himself the trick of it. That was the thing not one of them grasped. All these people circling him under the gold light. For 12 years, women had chased Emmerich Vale. They chased the name and the ports, and the men who moved through the dark at his word. The danger stitched into him, the rumor of him, and the winter in him, that each of them privately believed she alone could melt. They wrote to him. They arranged the seating so their shoulders would brush his. And he let every last one of them slide off him, because somewhere in the ruin of his 19th year, the part of a man that reaches for another person had been cut out, and the wound sealed shut with fire. Marrying Delphine Kessler was not a thaw, it was arithmetic. The Kesslers owned the mountain rail and the freight that came down out of the passes. The Vales owned the harbor and the black water of the bay. Bound together, the two houses would hold every road and every tide in and out of the city, and no one, not the old families, not the commissioners on the payroll, not the patient men who had waited a decade for Emmerich to finally show a soft side. Ambrose had laid the whole thing, brick by brick, across 2 years of quiet dinners. It was, the family agreed, the shrewdest move the Vales had made in a generation. Emmerich turned the glass slowly in his fingers and, without deciding to, looked down at his own right hand. at the smallest finger, where for the first 19 years of his life there had lived the faint, cool press of his mother's ring whenever she took his face in her hands. The ring was gone. It had been gone since the night the house at Hollowmere burned. And in 12 years of tearing the city open, of breaking hands, and buying whispers, and following every thin rumor, down into every gutter it led to, he had never found it, and he had never once let himself stop looking. "You're doing it again," Ambrose said. "Gentle doing what?" "Looking at your hand." The old man's face went soft in that way. It kept only for him. "She would be proud of the man you've become. Emmerich, Aurelia, all of this." He turned his glass toward the light, the crowd, the roses. "She only ever wanted you safe." "She'd have hated this party," Emmerich said. And, for the first time all evening, the ghost of something almost like warmth moved at the corner of his mouth. Ambrose chuckled and drifted off to soothe another anxious cousin, and Emmerich stood alone in the center of all that noise. And that was the moment he noticed the woman near the service doors, who was not looking at him the way every other person in the room looked at him. She was no one. That was the first verdict his eye returned, trained as it was to sort any room into threat and not threat, inside a single breath. A thin, gray coat, still buttoned, wrong among all the silken stones. Dark hair pinned back without any care for how it fell. A face built to be forgotten the instant she left a room. No jewels, no invitation in her hand. Half swallowed by the shadow of the doorway, with her fists pushed down into her pockets. A caterer, maybe. Someone from the kitchens, who had drifted where she had no business drifting. Except she was looking straight at him. Not hungry, not calculating, not measuring him, for the empire behind him. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a grave they have traveled a very long way to reach, steady, sorrowing, certain. As if she had crossed half her life to stand here and make sure the face was really his. Then she drew her hands out of her pockets and stepped forward out of the dark and started across the open floor toward him, and something at the base of Emmerich Vale's skull went cold and came sharply, dangerously awake. She should never have gotten within 30 feet of him. That was the detail that would keep Emmerich awake in the nights afterward. That a woman in a worn gray coat had crossed a wide open floor toward the most heavily guarded man in the city, and not one of his people had shifted to stop her. Bastien was posted by the bar. 2 more of his men held the doors, and every one of them, when he pressed them later, swore the same impossible thing, that they had looked directly at her and somehow failed to see her at all. She had that quality about her. She moved through the bright, watchful room the way a draft moves under a door, present, unignorable once you felt it, and utterly unseen until then. Emmerich did not signal anyone. He wanted to see what she would do. She stopped an arm's length from him. Closer, she was younger than the coat, had aged her perhaps in her mid-20s, a scatter of pale freckles across her nose, eyes, the flat brown of river water under winter light. A yellowing bruise sat along one cheekbone, half hidden under something she'd smoothed over it, the kind of mark he noticed, the way other men noticed the shape of a mouth. Her lips were cracked with cold. Her hands, when they came free of her pockets, were chapped and red. "Mr. Vale," she said. Her voice came out low and level, and it did not shake, though he could see plainly now that the rest of her was trembling. A fine, constant shiver she was spending everything she had to master. "Forgive me for the interruption." "You're not on the guest list," he said. "No." The smallest movement crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "I've never been on anyone's list. That's how I've stayed alive this long." He should have been annoyed. He should have lifted 2 fingers and let Bastien fold her up and carry her out into the snow. Instead, he stood rooted where he was, held fast by the way she was looking at him, and he watched her raise her right hand between them, close it into a fist, and slowly turn it over. "I've been trying to give this back to you for a very long time," she said. "I couldn't. It was never safe. It still isn't, but I've run out of time to wait for safe. She swallowed. Please don't let it fall. Her fingers uncurled. In the hollow of her cold red palm lay a ring, old rose gold gone thin at the band, a single small clouded garnet, the deep red of old wine, set into a ring of tiny worked leaves. On the inside of the band, he knew it without needing to turn it, knew it the way he knew his own pulse, were 3 words in his grandmother's tongue. The words his mother had loved: "Resta con me, stay with me." The floor of the world dropped out from beneath Emmerich Vale. He did not move for 3 full beats of his heart. The quartet sawed on. Somewhere at his back, Delphine loosed her bright cold laugh. And he stood staring down at a ring he had last seen on his mother's living hand 12 years ago, on a face already gone slack, in a house already filling with smoke. "Where?" he said. His voice came out wrong and he heard it, and hated it. "Where did you get this?" "I kept it," she said, and then, so quietly, that afterward he would never be entirely sure he had heard it and not dreamed it. "It was never lost, Mr. Vale." "Hidden, not lost. There's a difference. And the difference is a person." He reached for the ring, and for one instant his fingertips grazed the cold skin of her palm, and that plain, ordinary human contact went through him like a live wire. He looked up from the ring to her face to loose the 1,000 questions detonating behind his teeth. She was already stepping back. "They know I've surfaced," she said, still low, still level, still holding herself steady, even as her eyes filled with something that looked like grief and looked like fear and looked most of all like a goodbye, rehearsed 100 times. "So you have to hear me now, because I don't think I get to say it twice. The family you're about to marry into." Her glance flicked once past his shoulder to where Delphine stood glittering under the light. "They already took everything from you once. Don't let them take it a second time and call it a wedding." "Wait," Emmerich said. She did not wait. She turned and walked back toward the service doors with that same unhurried, unnoticeable ease. The gray coat drawing her down into the gray edge of the room. And by the time the paralysis broke in, and by the time he closed his fist around his mother's ring and snapped Bastien's name across the hall, hard enough to turn a dozen heads, she was already through the doors, already down the back stair, already gone into the falling snow. All that remained in the doorway was a single wet footprint, melting on the marble and the fading warmth of her hand still ghosting against his skin. He stood in the middle of his own engagement party, with 12 years of buried grief closed inside one fist and 2 certainties settled over him with the cold clarity that had kept him alive his entire life. The first was that everything he had built his safety on was about to come apart in his hands. The second was that he would find that woman, if he had to take the city apart, street by street, to do it. Nobody remembers her. Bastien turned his broad hands palm up, and for the first time in 8 years at Emmerich's shoulder, the big man looked genuinely rattled. "Boss, I've got 50 guests who'd swear they stood right next to her, and not one can tell me the color of her hair. The kitchen never took her on, the coat room never checked her coat. She walked in off the street, said her piece, and the whole room agreed to unsee her. They were in the study by then, the party still humming 3 floors below, like a machine that hadn't noticed its owner had left it." Emmerich stood at the tall black window with the ring shut inside his fist, and the snow falling heavy through the reach of the garden lamps. He had not opened his hand since the ballroom, half afraid that if he did, the ring would be gone, and he would learn he'd finally lost his mind 12 years too late. "The cameras," he said, "pulled all of them. She's on them, after a fashion, always turning away, always half behind somebody. Best frame we have is the back of a gray coat." He hesitated. "Except the service stare, she looks up, right into the lens, like she knew, to the inch, where it was hung." He laid a printed still on the desk, curling at one corner, a plain, unremarkable face, tipped up into hard light, the fading bruise a smudge along one cheek. "I ran her against everything we can reach. No license, no record, no employer, no history. This woman does not exist, boss." The study door opened without a knock, and Ambrose came in, and behind him Delphine Kessler, in her emeralds and her cold bright fury. "There you are," she said. "You walked out of your own engagement party to chase a kitchen girl." "My father is asking questions I'm running out of graceful ways to answer." A few sharp steps into the room. "What did she say to you?" "People saw your face." "She gave something back to me," Emmerich said, without turning from the glass. "That's all." Ambrose had gone very still beside the desk. His eyes were on Emmerich's closed fist, and his warm, seamed face wore a careful, practiced blankness that Emmerich, somehow in 12 years, had never once thought to distrust. "Gave what back, Emmerich?" Emmerich opened his hand. The ring sat in his palm, thin and worn and unmistakable, and he watched the two of them look at it. Delphine's face folded into plain confusion. "It's a ring, an ugly old ring. Why is he holding it like it's still warm?" And that told him she was not in this, or not knowingly, and he watched Ambrose. For half a second, before the old man's face arranged itself into the correct shape of astonishment, Emmerich saw something cross behind his eyes he had never seen in a lifetime of being loved by him. He saw fear. Then it was gone, and Ambrose stepped forward, breath-catching, hand rising to his mouth. "Madonna, is that Emmerich? Is that Aurelia's after all these years?" His voice thickened. His eyes shone. It was a flawless performance, and had Emmerich not been staring at him a heartbeat too early, he'd have believed every note of it, the way he had believed everything this man ever told him. "Who is she? Where did she find it?" "That," Emmerich said slowly, closing his fist again, "is what I intend to find out. Let it lie." Ambrose said it gently, the way he'd said 1,000 hard, wise things across the years. "A woman appears, the week of your wedding, hands you a ghost, whispers poison about the Kesslers, and slips into the dark. That's not a gift, son. That's bait. Bury the ring with your mother, marry the girl, and be safe." And there it was. Emmerich had told no one what the woman whispered about the Kesslers. Not Bastien, not Delphine. He had held it behind his teeth the way he held everything. But Ambrose had just soothed away a warning that had never once been spoken aloud in that room. The cold came down over Emmerich then. The old, familiar cold that had carried him through 12 years of men who smiled while they lied. He kept his face empty. He had learned that trick from a master, and he understood now exactly who the master had been. "You're right," Emmerich said. "It's late. Tell Corwin. His daughter was the finest thing in the room. We'll settle the last of the arrangements tomorrow." Relief loosened something in the old man's shoulders. He crossed the room, gripped Emmerich's arm, warm, firm, familiar, and Emmerich let him. "Sleep," Ambrose said. "You look like you've seen the dead walk." "Maybe I have," Emmerich said, when they were gone. Delphine first, still smoldering, then Ambrose with one last unreadable glance at the closed fist. Emmerich let the mask slide off his face. Bastien waited by the door, saying nothing. Because Bastien had also heard a man answer a question no one had asked. "He knew what she told me," Emmerich said, very quietly. "About the Kesslers. I never said it. You were here." "Did I say it?" "You didn't say it, boss." Emmerich looked down at the printed still, the plain face tilted up into the light, the woman who did not exist. She had walked into the most dangerous room in the city, to hand back the one thing he had never stopped grieving, and asked for nothing. "Find her," he said. "I don't care what it costs, and I don't care whose ground she's on. Before this wedding, I want to be standing in front of that woman." He turned the ring once, in his fingers, and the worn engraving caught the lamplight. "Resta con me, stay with me. Because either she is the finest trap anyone has ever built for me," he said, "or she is the only person in this city who hasn't lied to my face in 12 years, and I need to know which, before I put a ring on Delphine Kessler's hand." Outside, the snow kept falling, quietly filling in the last of the prints she had left behind. It took his people 2 days to find her. By the time they did, Emmerich would wish to God they had been faster. Marrow Street did not appear on any map the city liked to hand to visitors, and the cabs wouldn't take a fare there after dark. It was the stretch of town the harbor had abandoned when the money drifted uptown, a dead-end spine of tenements leaning into one another over a road the plows had given up on, so that after 3 days of weather, it had all gone to a churned gray slush that froze at the gutters into black glass. Emmerich had Bastien stop the car at the mouth of it. "I'll walk the rest," he said. "Boss, in there. Alone. At least, let me put 2 men on the. Keep the engine warm. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, come in loud." Emmerich turned his collar up against the wind and stepped out into the cold, and the heavy door thumped shut behind him, like the last civil word of the world he was leaving. He walked. He did not hurry. He had learned long ago that a man who moves slowly through a bad place is a man who is telling that place he does not fear it, and he needed not to fear it now, because everything under his ribs had gone tight and wrong since Bastien had put the address in his palm 2 hours before. It was not a good address. It was worse than he had let himself picture, and he had spent 2 days picturing. He had told himself a comfortable story across those 2 days, that she was a professional, a plant, a working piece of somebody's machine, and that he'd climb to a clean apartment and find a woman with 3 telephones and a handler on the line and get his answers the hard way. Marrow Street was not the address of a professional. It was the address of someone who had gone to ground from the entire world with nothing left to bargain with. The snow came sideways now, fine and stinging. The few street lamps that still lived buzzed and stuttered. Most stood dark, their bulbs shot out, or simply dead of neglect. He passed a doorway where 3 men warmed their hands over a fire in a punched-out steel drum, and they looked at his coat and his shoes, and did the arithmetic of what he might be worth, and then they looked at his face and did a different arithmetic entirely and stepped back into the black. Somewhere a dog barked itself raw. Somewhere overhead a baby was crying and crying, and no one was going to it, and the sound wound down through the thin walls into the street, like something slowly being given up on. Why, here, he kept thinking. She had held his mother's ring for 12 years. She had walked unseen into a room full of the deadliest people in the city and walked back out of it. She was not helpless, and she was not a fool. A woman with that much quiet in her could have sold the ring alone, for enough to live small and safe for a decade, could have made herself a life in any anonymous corner of the country. And instead, she was here, in the last frozen ditch of the city, in the kind of building the police only entered to carry something out. He reached the dead end. The last house on the left, Bastien had said. Top floor, back. The front door hung off a single hinge, its lock long ago torn out of the wood, and the stairwell past it swallowed what little the street had to give. That was where the cold found the base of his spine and turned it to water. The door had not simply been left ajar. The wood around the vanished lock was fresh splintered, pale and raw against the old grime, splinters he could see even in the dark. And on the 3rd step up, catching the last of the streetlight, lay a single dark drop, then another, 4 steps higher. He crouched, touched 2 fingers to it, brought them up, and knew from the smell, before he ever saw the color, exactly what it was. Blood, not old, not much, a trail, climbing. He drew the gun, then the weight of it settling into his hand like an answer to a question, and went up the black stairs, with the silence he had been raised inside. The building breezed around him as he climbed, following the small dark drops from tread to tread. Behind one door, a television muttered to no one. Behind another, 2 voices rose and fell in a language he did not know, tired and circling, an argument worn so smooth by repetition that it had long ago stopped expecting to be won. The stairwell narrowed as it went up, the treads soft and giving under his weight, the wallpaper peeling off the plaster in long dead curls. And the cold deepened with every floor, not the clean moving cold of the street, but a still, held, indoor cold, the cold of a place where the heat had been shut off a long time ago and never once turned back on. By the third landing, his own breath was showing white in front of his face. The drops led him to the top floor, to the back, to a door standing an inch open with its frame hanging in pieces around the broken lock. And behind it, cold air pouring out into the hall. Colder still, the dead flat cold of a room with no heat and a window that would not shut. He pushed the door wide with the barrel of the gun. The smell reached him first, copper and cold, and the sour animal reek of a body that had been afraid for a long time. He stepped inside, sweeping the muzzle across the dark, and the streetlight through the bare window laid the room out in shades of gray. And there, folded into the far corner where two walls met, half hidden behind a battered tin held to her chest, was the shape of a woman with a broken length of chair leg raised in one shaking hand. "Don't," she said. Her voice was a ruin. "I've nothing left worth taking, and I'll still put your eye out trying." Then the light found her face, and Emmerich Vale forgot how to breathe. She was dying by inches, and she had arranged herself to make it look like she was only resting. She had propped her back into the angle of the corner, the way a person does when sitting upright, has become the whole of what her body can still manage. The gray coat was gone. Under it, she wore a thin sweater soaked black down one side, the black spreading out from a wad of cloth she had bound against her hip with what looked like a torn strip of bedsheet. Her lips had gone the blue-gray of deep cold. Her hair clung to her face in damp ropes, despite the freezing air, and when she lifted the splintered chair leg another inch, her whole arm shook with the cost of it, as if the wood weighed as much as she did. The yellow bruise he'd marked at the party had a fresh red-black companion now, high on the same cheek, and one eye was swollen to a slit, but it was the tin that undid him. Bleeding out on the floor of a freezing room, barely able to hold a stick of wood off the ground, and she had two things: the weapon and the tin. And it was the tin she was truly guarding. Her whole thin body curled around it the way a hand curls around a candle flame in the wind. Whatever was inside it, she had decided long ago, it was worth more than the last of her blood. "It's you," she breathed. The chair leg wavered. Something in her ruined face changed as her one good eye found his and clung to it. And it was not fear. And it was not the flat, sorrowing certainty from the ballroom. It was worse than either. It was relief. "You came." I thought I'd left it too long." A sound came out of her that might have been a laugh if it hadn't turned wet and torn halfway. "You're standing in the blood. You always did carry the whole outdoors in, with you. 12 years, and nobody ever taught you to wipe your feet." Emmerich lowered the gun. Slowly he went down into a crouch, so that his eyes came level with hers, across the small, dead-cold room. "When?" he said. "When did you ever watch me wipe my feet?" The chair leg slid out of her fingers, not thrown down, dropped, because her hand had simply stopped being able to hold it. It clattered against the bare boards, and she did not reach for it. She looked at him with that terrible relief and that terrible exhaustion, and she said, "You don't know me." "Of course you don't. Nobody was ever meant to. I was the help. I was 14 years old, and I was the housekeeper's girl, and boys like you didn't." She had to stop and breathe, and the breath snagged on something broken low in her side. "Undine. My mother was Undine. She kept the house at Hollowmere. She left the kitchen window open on summer nights, so I could stand in the yard and hear your mother play the piano in the dark." The floor of the world dropped away beneath him, the same as it had in the ballroom, except this time it went on falling. Undine. He could see her all at once, hauled up whole out of 12 years of buried things. A slight, quick woman who hummed under her breath as she worked, who smelled of bread and cold stone, whose daughter was always somewhere just out of the corner of your eye, folded into a doorway watching. The house at Hollowmere. The house in the hills, where the family went when the city turned dangerous. The house where his mother had burned. And the girl. He reached for the girl, and came up with only fragments. A thin child forever at the edge of the frame, a pair of dark eyes over a banister, A small figure he must have passed 100 times in 100 hallways and never once troubled to name. He had been 19 and full of himself, and certain the whole world was arranged for his convenience, and the housekeeper's daughter had been less than furniture to him, a draught he never felt on his skin. He had not seen her then. No one ever had, and that he understood with a slow, sick lurch, was the whole point of her, the exact thing that had kept her breathing for 12 years, and the exact thing he would be ashamed of for the rest of his life. "Your name," Emmerich said. His voice had gone somewhere very low and very quiet. He had crossed the space between them without deciding to. He was on his knees before her now, and his hands hovered over her, the way a man's hands hover over a thing he is terrified to touch, and more terrified not to. "Tell me your name." "It doesn't exist anymore. I made certain of that a long time ago." Her eye was sliding shut. He caught her chin, gently, so gently, the way his mother used to catch his own face between her hands, and her skin was furnace hot against his cold fingers, the fever running so high he could feel it coming off her like heat off a stove. "You want to know the strangest part. Your mother named me, not this name I use, the other one, the real one, the one I threw away to stay alive." Her mouth twisted, half grief, half wonder. "She caught me in the garden one morning, naming the birds wrong, and she sat down in the wet grass in her good dress and taught me every one of them, and when we came to the little brown singing one, she said, 'That one is you, that is a linnet, small and plain, and nobody looks twice, and it has the finest song in the whole hedge.' I kept it. When I buried who I was, I kept the name she gave me. It's the only piece of her I let myself keep out where I could touch it." "Linnet," he said. The name broke a little in his mouth. "She'd like that you finally said it," she whispered. "She used to say nobody ever saw me. She was right. It's the only reason I'm not dead. Nobody ever sees me, not even the men who've spent 12 years hunting me to get that ring back before it could ever reach your hand." Her good eye opened, and up through the fever and the pain came the same clear, unkillable steadiness that had carried her across a ballroom full of killers. "But you have to listen now, Emmerich, because I don't have much left, and if I go before you hear it, then they win, and your mother stays murdered under the wrong name forever. Nobody is dying." It came out of him like an oath sworn to God, like a command flung in the face of the cold. He was already moving, already stripping off his coat, already wrapping it around her thin shoulders, already turning his head to roar Bastien's name down the black stairwell loud enough to wake the whole abandoned street. "You are not going to die on this floor. Do you hear me? You did not survive 12 years to die on the floor 4 days short of the finish. Talk while I lift you. Talk and stay awake. Who did this to you? Who hurt you?" "The same people who did the first thing," she said against his shoulder as he gathered her up, and she weighed so little it frightened him, barely there in his arms, as if the long years of hiding had worn her down to almost nothing. Her hand, even now even half gone, would not release the battered tin. "The night at Hollowmere. The night your mother," her breath hitched. "And this time it was not the wound. I've been carrying it for you for 12 years. The ring, and the truth about who was really standing in the doorway when the fire started. I need you to hear all of it, and I need you to hear it now, because I've kept it alone in the dark long enough, and I am so tired, Emmerich. I am so tired of being the only one who knows." And Emmerich Vale, carrying the woman no one had ever seen down a black stairwell 4 days before his wedding, bent his head close to hers and said, "Then don't carry it alone 1 more minute. Tell me, I've got you. Tell me who opened the door." It came out of her in pieces, on the black stairs, in the back of the speeding car, with her head fallen into his lap, and Bastien, taking the corners, as if the devil were riding the bumper, in the ragged gaps between Emmerich's own voice saying, "Stay awake, stay with me, finish it." And every piece landed on him like a stone dropped from a great height, until he was buried whole under the crushing weight of the thing he had gotten wrong for 12 years. She had been 14 years old. It was the second week at Hollowmere, the family driven up into the hills, because the city had turned dangerous, because someone had been feeding their comings and goings to men who wanted the veils in the ground. Ondine did the cooking. Lynette did what invisible children do. She folded herself into the seams of the house and watched a world that never once thought to watch her back. And so it was Lynette and no one the family would ever have believed who saw the thing no survivor was meant to see. She saw who opened the door. There was a man, she whispered. Her fist knotted weakly in his shirt. Your family's man. The one everyone trusted with their lives. He came up to the house that afternoon, before it happened. He walked the whole grounds, slow, like he was saying goodbye to it. And he sent the two gatemen down to the orchard to look for a fault in a fence line that was perfectly sound. And that night, when the cars came up the drive with their headlamps dark, the scullery door, the little one by the kitchen, the one your mother bolted with her own hands every single night, it was standing open. I was in the larder. I watched his hands work the bolt back and prop it wide, and then I watched him walk out to his own car and drive away, 10 minutes before the men came through it. Who? Emmerich said. He already knew. God help him, he had known. Since the study, since a beloved mouth had answered a question no one had asked. But he needed to hear her say the name aloud in the small hot dark of the car so that it could never again be unsaid. Said. Ambrose, Lynette breathed. It was Ambrose. He unbolted the door, and he left. And the men came in out of the snow. Your mother found me in the larder when the shooting started. She didn't shout. She pushed me down behind the flour sacks, into the dark, and she pulled her ring off her own finger, and folded my hand shut around it, and she put her mouth against my ear, and she said, Lynette's voice broke clean through. Now, 12 years of it splitting at once. Put it in my son's hand and tell him rest upon me, tell him I stay, and then she stood up, on purpose. She stood up tall in the middle of the room so their eyes would go to her and not to the sacks. So they wouldn't look down and find a 14-year-old girl. A sob tore up out of her. She died, so they'd look at her, Emmerich. And my mother, Ondine, she came back into that burning house through the scullery to find me, and she pulled me out the coal hatch with the ring locked in my fist, and she carried me down through the orchard, to the birches at the edge, and that is where they caught us. She put her whole body over mine, in the snow. When the guns came up, both of them, both our mothers, so that a nobody could carry a ring across 12 years and lay it in your hand. The car was silent, but for the engine screaming and her ragged breathing, and the ocean roar of blood in Emmerich's ears. 12 years rearranged themselves behind his eyes as she spoke, every remembered kindness turning slowly over to show its rotten underside. Ambrose teaching a shaking 19-year-old to hold a pistol steady in the raw weeks after the fire. Ambrose beside him at the double graves in the rain, his hand heavy and warm on a boy's shoulder. Ambrose saying, every year on the anniversary, in that same soft, breaking voice, she'd be so proud of you. She only ever wanted you safe. Every one of them a brick the old man had laid, patient and loving, over the door he had left standing open on purpose. He had not been comforting a grieving boy across 12 years. He had been minding a witness he'd forgotten to make certain was dead. Why didn't you come to me? He said, and his voice had gone to gravel and ash. 12 years. Why did you never come? Because he never once left your side. She said it so gently, so without accusation, that it was worse than any blow. Ambrose raised you out of the ashes. Ambrose fed you, and taught you, and stood at your shoulder at every graveside. And I was a 14-year-old ghost, with no name and no proof on this earth, but my own 2 eyes, and the one man who could have had me killed with a nod. Was the one man you would never, ever stop believing. If I had come to you at 16, at 20, at 25, and said the man who raised you unbolted the door on your mother, you would have handed me straight to him, You'd have given him the ring, and me, and never known you'd done it. So, I did, the only thing a nobody can do. Her hand tightened on the battered tin, still crushed to her chest. I disappeared. I made myself into no one at all. And I collected, for 12 years. Every meeting, every payment, every time Ambrose sold another piece of you to the people who wanted you dead, I wrote it down, I kept the proof, I hid it in a tea tin like a madwoman. And I would have kept collecting and kept hiding, until I was an old woman, Emmerich. I swear it to you. I'd have died with this tin, and never once troubled your life, except 3 months ago, I learned what he had arranged for you now. The wedding, Emmerich said. The wedding. Her eye found his in the dark. The Kesslers, Emmerich. The cars, on the drive that night. The money behind the guns. It was Corwin Kessler. Corwin ordered your family burned 12 years ago, and Ambrose opened the door for him, and it didn't quite take, because a boy lived through it and grew into something they are all still afraid of. So now they mean to finish it the patient way. They mean to marry it. In 4 days, you put a ring on Delphine Kessler's hand, and you fold your harbor and your water and your whole armored life into the house that murdered your mother. And Ambrose signs every page of it legal, and then, within the year, there is an accident. A clean one. And it all passes to your grieving widow and her father, and the man who unbolted the door grows old and rich on the very last of your blood. Her voice was guttering now, the fever and the blood loss dragging her down. That is what the ring was meant to buy them. My silence. Your mother left forever in an unmarked grave under a lie. And I could not let them have it clean, so I stopped hiding. I walked into your party, and I put the ring in your hand. And they realized I'd surfaced, and they sent someone to make sure I never got to talk, and left me on that floor so it would look like the neighborhood had done it. She was going. He could see the light in her guttering low. Ahead, Bastien was shouting that they were 3 minutes out, that the doctor was already waiting at the house, that she only had to hold on. Emmerich bent low over her, his forehead nearly against hers, and for the first time since he was 19 years old he felt the thing he had cut out of himself and sealed, shut with fire, come roaring back into the hollow all at once. Grief and love and a fury so vast and so cold that it felt as though the whole frozen bay had risen up inside his chest. "Stay awake," he said into her damp hair. "Stay awake, little Linnet. You carried her 12 years. Carry her 3 more minutes. That is an order, and it is the last order I will ever give you, because after tonight, you never carry anything alone again. Do you hear me? Never again. You believe me," she whispered. It was not a question. It was pure, disbelieving wonder that after 12 years alone in the dark, one person had finally listened. "You actually believe me." "I believe you," Emmerich said. "God forgive me for how late I came to it. I believe every word." The gates of the compound tore open ahead of them in the snow, and the car screamed up the drive toward the light, and in his arms the woman no one had ever seen let her eyes fall shut at last, but her hand, even unconscious, even dying, would not surrender the tin that held the truth she had kept breathing for him across 12 frozen years. And across the city, in a warm and well-lit house, Ambrose was pouring himself a glass of something old and good. He stood at his own window and watched the snow come down over the quiet street, and he thought with the deep contentment of a patient man that in 4 days it would all be done at last, the harbor, the water, the final loose veil folded safely into the ledger, 12 years of waiting rewarded in full. He lifted the glass, alone, to a wedding 4 days off. He had not the faintest idea that a 14-year-old girl he had once walked past without a glance had just laid a battered tea tin on Emmerich Vale's desk, and that the door had, at long last, come open on him. "Dr. A." Sable worked on her for 2 hours in a room in the East Wing, and Emmerich did not once leave it. He stood at the foot of the bed, with his back to the wall, and his mother's ring shut in his fist, and made himself watch all of it. He watched Sable clean and dress the wound along her side, an injury someone had left untreated on purpose, cruel in its patience, and heard the numbers spoken low. The fever, the exhaustion, the infection that had gone too long without help. And beneath them, he heard the thing Sable would not quite say, that by every rule she should not have lasted this long, and the only reason she had was that she had simply refused to give in until it was finished. "She's been starving," Sable said at one point, quiet, threading a line into the back of her hand. "Not for days, for years, on and off. This is a body that's been spending itself down to the wick for a very long time." He glanced up. Whatever she was doing, she did it on an empty tank and no help from anyone. 12 years. Merrick thought of the tin, of the patient invisible, collecting of a woman, making herself smaller and hungrier by the year, so no one would ever glance at her twice, so that she could keep his mother's ring safe and his mother's murder written down for him against a day he might never have let arrive. He thought of Ambrose's hand closing warm around his arm 2 nights ago. "She only ever wanted you safe." The rage in him had gone very still now. It had stopped being a thing he felt and started being a thing he simply was. The phone against his chest buzzed. He looked at the screen. Delphine. He looked at Lynette, gray on the white pillow, breathing because a machine and her own stubbornness were making her. He thought about laying his harbor and his water and his name into the manicured hand of the daughter of the man who had ordered his mother burned while a 14-year-old girl watched from beneath her own dying mother in the snow. He answered. He kept his eyes on Lynette. "Where are you?" Delphine's voice came tight and bright and furious. "My father has flown in half the coast. The rehearsal is tomorrow, and you have vanished to play nursemaid to a Delphine." He said it softly, and she stopped, because there was something in the softness that even she could feel, the way animals feel the pressure drop before the storm arrives. "Listen carefully, and tell your father exactly what I say. I'd a word for word." "What?" "There is no rehearsal," Emmerich said. "There is no wedding. It is finished. All of it." The silence on the line had a shape to it. He could hear her recalculating in it, could hear the fear come up beneath the fury. "You can't," she said. "Emmerich, my father will." "Your father sent someone to a room on Marrow Street," Emmerich said, "and left a woman there to die alone on a cold floor because she carried something of mine. 12 years ago he sent cars up a hill to Hollowmere. Tell him I know what he took there. Tell him I found what he was so sure had burned. The harbor is closed to him. The water is closed to him. And if I see one Kessler shadow cross my line before this is done, I won't send word back, the polite way he taught you. I'll bring it to his door myself." He paused. "You were never the trap, Delphine, so here is one kindness free of charge. Get out from under your father tonight, because tomorrow it begins, and I am not going to be careful about who is standing near him when it does." Emmerich, he ended the call. He set the phone face down on the dresser. He did not crush it. The man who crushed telephones was a younger man with something to prove, and he had nothing left to prove and everything left to finish. Across the room, in the bed, Lynette's cracked lips moved. He was beside her in an instant, bending low. "You called it off," she breathed, without opening her eyes, even now some sliver of that impossible watchfulness still running under the fever. "I heard you. You called off the wedding." "I canceled the transaction," Emmerich said, and something in his chest pulled tight at the smallness of her, at the fact that the first thing she surfaced for was to be sure he was safe. That's all it ever was. Sleep. "They'll move now," she murmured. "You've backed them into a corner. They can't let you live now." "Then, let them come." He drew the blanket up, over her thin shoulder, over the clean new bandages, over 12 years of hurt she had never once handed to a living soul. "Little Lynette, for the first time in your whole life, somebody else does the carrying. Sleep." She slept. And Emmerich Vale walked out of that room and down through his beautiful cold house to the study, where a battered tea tin sat waiting on the desk, and he sat down, and he lifted the lid, and he began at last to read the truth a 14-year-old girl had kept alive alone in the dark for 12 years. By the time the sky began to gray, the man who had wanted only to be left safe was gone. What sat in his chair when the light came up was the thing the Kesslers and Ambrose had spent 12 years congratulating themselves on having put quietly to sleep. They had built their entire patient plan on the certainty that the boy from Hollowmere would stay asleep forever. They had just woken him all the way up. He read until 3 in the morning, and what he found in the tea tin rewrote the last 12 years of his lifeline by patient line. It was all there, exactly as she'd said, kept with a care that broke something in him a little further with every page. She'd had no computers, no encryption, no resources of any kind. She had never had anything, so she had done it the only way a ghost with nothing can. Photographs curling at their corners, dates penciled on the backs, in a child's careful hand, slowly growing into a woman's. A page torn from the Hollowmere household ledger, 12 years old, 2 gatemen signed down to the orchard, on the night of the fire in Ambrose's own unmistakable slanting hand. Receipts, a funeral card, a matchbook from a harbor restaurant, where she had once sat 3 tables away, and watched Ambrose break bread with Corwin Kessler. 11 years before anyone was ever meant to know, the 2 houses had so much as spoken. Every scrap of it, nothing on its own, all of it together, laid end to end across his desk in the lamplight, a rope strong enough to hang a man who had kissed his brow at every Christmas of his life. He was still there when he heard it. A dragging sound. Cloth against wood. He was on his feet with the gun half drawn before his mind caught up to his hands. And then he saw her in the study doorway, and his heart turned clean over in his chest. She should not have been able to stand. She had crossed the whole dark length of the east wing to reach him, one hand white-knuckled on the pole of the drip stand she was using as a crutch, the other pressed flat to her bandaged side, wearing one of his shirts that Sable must have put her in, black cotton swallowing her whole to the middle of her thigh. Her face was a ruin of yellows and purples, but her eyes, when they found his across the room and dropped to the open tin, and the truth spread beneath the lamp, were fever-bright and stubbornly, ferociously awake. "You're meant to be unconscious," he said. "I heard the lid." Her voice was a thread. "You opened it without me, Lynette." He crossed the room fast and got an arm around her, just as her knee gave, taking her weight, and she was so light against him that the fury flared white behind his eyes, all over again, light as paper, light as the small brown bird his mother had named her for. A woman who had carried the whole weight of his ruin across 12 years, while weighing nothing at all. "You are going to tear yourself open. Sit down before you fall down." "I have kept that tin alive since I was 14 years old," she said into his chest, her free hand fisting in his shirt to hold herself upright. "I have never once let another living soul lay a finger on it. Don't ask me to lie in a bed down the hall and trust that a man is reading it right. I can't. Do you understand me? I can't." Her breath snagged. "It is the only thing I have ever done that mattered. Let me finish it beside you, please." The word stopped him, cold. Please. He turned the whole night over in an instant. The ballroom, the freezing room on Marrow Street, the car, and understood that in all of it, through all of it, she had never once asked him for a single thing. She had informed him. She had warned him. She had put the ring and the truth in his hands, and turned to walk away into the snow with nothing at all. She did not beg. She had built herself, deliberately, over 12 years, into a person who could not afford to need anything, because to need was to be seen, and to be seen was to die. And now here she stood in his study, bleeding through her stitches, holding herself up by a fistful of his shirt, saying, "Please," and he understood it was the single most frightening thing she was capable of doing, and she was doing it anyway for this. "All right," he said, very low, into her hair. "All right, but not on your feet." He didn't ask permission. He lifted her. She made a small sound of protest he ignored, and carried her to the deep leather chair behind the desk, and set her down in it, like something without price, and dragged an ottoman over, and lifted her braced leg onto it with both hands. Then he pulled a second chair around to the same side of the desk, beside her rather than across from her, so that they sat on the same side of everything, with the tin open between them, shared. "Show me," he said. "Walk me through all of it? And then, Lynette, you are going to sleep for a week while I take their entire world apart, and those are the terms, and they are not open for discussion." The ghost of a real smile touched her broken mouth. "You always did believe that giving an order was the same thing as being obeyed. It worked on everyone but you." "It never worked on me," she said softly. "I only ever let you think it did." And for one strange, suspended moment in the lamplight, with 12 years of grief and proof spread across the desk, and both their mothers in the cold ground, they looked at each other, the man no woman had ever reached, and the woman no one had ever seen. And something passed between them that neither of them had a word for, and neither of them tried to name. Then she picked up the first photograph, and her voice steadied into the flat, exact cadence of a woman who had rehearsed this 1,000 times alone in the dark, for an audience she never believed she would get, and she began to lay out for Emmerich Vale exactly how his family had been sold, and by whom and for how much, and precisely what it would take to make every last one of them answer for it. Once, deep in it, he lifted a small square photograph from the very bottom of the tin and went utterly still. Aurelia in the garden at Hollowmere, laughing at something outside the frame, and half hidden in her skirts, a thin, dark-haired girl with a bird cupped between two careful hands. He had never seen it. He had no pictures at all of that last summer. Every one had burned with the house. "I went back," Lynette said quietly, watching him find it after. "Once it was safe. In the spring I went up to the ruin, and I dug through the ash with my hands until I found the box she kept her photographs in. That one survived. It's the only picture of her I have in the world." Her voice caught. "I always thought you should be the one to keep it." Emmerich looked at his mother's face for a long moment, and his throat closed, and he set the photograph down apart from the evidence, in its own clean space at the edge of the desk, the way a man sets down something holy. They worked until the window began to gray. He learned that Ambrose had been on the Kessler payroll since before Hollowmere ever burned, that the whole slow marriage had been 12 years in the patient-making. He learned that Corwin Kessler was flying his own men into the city under the cover of the wedding guests, men who were already here, already checked into their hotels, already waiting. He learned that the entire plan turned on one narrow hinge: the wedding weekend, when Vale's security would be thinnest and most distracted, and most thoroughly infiltrated, when 100 armed strangers could stand in a church and no one would think to look twice. He learned, in short, that by calling off the wedding, he had kicked the timing out from under a 12-year plan and forced its architects to improvise. Cornered men, frightened men. Men who would now have to move fast, and move soon, and move sloppy. "They'll try tonight or tomorrow, at the latest," Lynette said, her eyes finally losing the fight, her head sinking against the wing of the chair. "They can't wait for the weekend now. And Ambrose will want to be there. He'll want to do it close. He'll want to look you in the I know where he'll be." Emmerich stood. The cold in him had hardened into something with a cutting edge. He took his coat from the back of the door. Her hand shot out and caught his sleeve. For the first time, real fear cracked through the exhaustion in her face, and he understood at once that it was not fear for herself. She had come to terms with her own death a long, long time ago. This was another kind of fear entirely, one she plainly had not felt in so many years that she barely recognized the shape of it. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare walk in there and get yourself killed." Not after I spent my whole life keeping you breathing. Emmerich crouched down in front of the chair. He lifted her cold hand off his sleeve and folded it between both of his. And then, because he could not help it, because the sealed place in his chest had come all the way open now and would not close again, he pressed his mouth to her bruised knuckles, once a thing he had not done for another living soul since he was a boy. When this is finished, he said, you are going to take me back up to Hollowmere, and you are going to stand me under the window your mother left open, and you are going to teach me the names of all the birds, every one. Properly this time, he looked up at her, so you don't get to be right about the funeral. Do you understand me? Stay alive. I am not carrying one more coffin linnet. Not one more, least of all yours. He set the gun on the desk beside her and showed her the safety. Lock the door behind me, he said. If it opens, and it isn't me, you empty it into whoever's standing there, and you don't spend 1 second feeling sorry about it. Say it back, empty it, don't feel sorry. Her jaw set, her hand closing around the black metal. Emmerich, what? Hidden, not lost, she whispered. The same 3 words she'd breathed at him across a ballroom a lifetime ago, except now they meant, come back. You've been hidden from your whole life. Don't go and get lost in the last hour of it. He stepped out into the hall and pulled the door shut, and heard the deadbolt slide home behind him with a hard final sound, and turned toward the coming dark with murder in his heart, and for once, a reason to come home from it. Ambrose kept a house on the water on the good side of the city, and he was not, as it turned out, difficult to find, because, in 12 years, it had never once occurred to him that he might one day need to hide. That was the arrogance of the man. He had lived so long inside Emmerich's trust that he had come to mistake it for a law of nature, a thing that could not fail any more than the tide could fail. And so, when the black cars came up his drive with their headlamps dark at 9 o'clock that night, he did not run, and he did not reach for a gun. He came out onto his own front steps, in his shirt sleeves with a glass of red wine in his hand, and when Emmerich climbed out of the lead car, the old man actually smiled. A wide, warm, terrible smile. The smile of a man welcoming home a beloved son. Emmerich. He spread his arms, wine and all. You look like something the sea spat back. Come in out of the cold. Come in, and tell your old uncle what in God's name has. Where were the 2 gate men? Emmerich said. The smile held. But something behind it went very still. What? The night at Hollowmere. The 2 men on the orchard gate. Somebody sent them down the hill an hour before the cars came, to hunt a fault in a fence that was perfectly sound. Somebody signed them down the hill in the household ledger, in his own hand. And then somebody slid back the bolt on the scullery door and propped it wide and got into his car and drove away. 10 minutes before the shooting started, Emmerich climbed the first step. Behind him, his men fanned silently out into the dark. I spent 12 years wondering how they got in. Ambrose, that door was always bolted. My mother bolted it herself every night of her life. I used to hear her do it, but that night it stood open. And you were already gone, down the road. The wine glass in Ambrose's hand had begun very slightly to shake. Someone's been whispering to you, he said, and his voice was still gentle, still reaching, still hunting for the boy he had raised. That woman. Emmerich, listen to me, listen to your uncle. Whatever. She showed you whatever she... Her name is Linnet. Emmerich took another step. Ondine's daughter. The girl from the kitchen. She was in the larder when you opened the door. You walked right past the sack she was hiding behind. You never saw her. No one ever saw her, and she watched your hands slide that bolt, and she has been watching you ever since. 12 years, Ambrose. Every meeting, every payment, every piece of me, you weighed out and sold to Corwin Kessler. She kept all of it. She kept it in a tea tin. His voice cracked. Once, and then went to ice. And she kept my mother's ring. The one you swore to me, the killers took off her hand. My mother pulled it off her own finger and gave it to a starving 14-year-old to keep away from you. She trusted a child she barely knew over the man who stood at her right hand. And she was right. The glass slipped from Ambrose's fingers and shattered on the stone. They were going to die anyway, the old man said. And now the mask was sliding off. Now the reaching stopped, and something older and colder showed through beneath it. Your father. Do you understand what he had become by the end? He was going to get every last one of us buried. Corwin came to me with a way to live through it, and I took it. Yes, it cost your mother. And I have carried that weight every single day since. You cannot know how you've carried it, Emeric repeated softly. And I raised you. I could have let Corwin finish you in the snow that night, and I did not. I hid you. I built you back up out of nothing. I made you strong. I gave you everything. You kept me alive, so you would have something left to sell, Emeric said. And this week, you finally found your buyer. You were going to hand me across the table, to the men who burned my mother, and call it a wedding. He stood at the top of the steps now, close enough to count the broken veins in the old man's cheeks, the spilled wine gone dark as ink on his cuff. 12 years. I loved you like my own blood. You stood beside me at her grave in the rain. You held me while I wept, and could not stop, and every single time, you already knew. Ambrose looked at the man he had made of a broken boy, and understood at last that there was no boy left inside it to reach, and the fear that Lynette had carried the memory of for 12 years came up naked and shining in his eyes. Emeric, he whispered. Son, please, she said. Please too, Emeric said, on a cold floor. While the man you sent stood over her and watched, he drew the gun. You don't get to. He made no speech of it. His mother had hated speeches. He only held the eyes of the man who had murdered her, long enough that Ambrose understood exactly whose reckoning had finally come for him, and exactly why. Whatever passed between them in that last moment on the steps stayed between them. When it was over, the warm and gentle voice was silent at last, and the door Ambrose had loved to open was closed behind him for good. For a moment, Emeric stood over him in the falling snow, the man who had bought him his first rifle and taught him to strip it blind, who had held a boy's face together after the funerals and lied with every gentle word of comfort. He felt no triumph. He felt only the strange, ringing hollowness of a debt called in 12 years late, after 12 years of interest. Then he holstered the gun and turned away, because there was still one road left open that the Kesslers believed they owned, and he meant to close it before the sun came up. The Kessler men came an hour later at the harbor, because Lynette had been right about all of it. Cornered, rushed, forced to move before they were ready. Emeric was there when they arrived. He stood in the dark between two stacked containers on Pier 9 and watched 3 unmarked trucks roll in through a gate that should have been guarded by men Ambrose had quietly reassigned weeks ago, and he watched the drivers climb down easy and unworried, expecting to load a distracted man's guns while that man wept somewhere across the city over a broken wedding. They walked instead into Vale Rifles, waiting at every road their own infiltrators had mapped. The very blind spots and gaps in the watch that Ambrose had sold to Corwin turned now back against the buyers. There was one shouted order, and then the dark came alive on every side of them at once. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it was in the end not even close. Most of them threw their weapons down onto the wet concrete the moment they understood how badly they'd been outplayed. The few who chose to fight did not hold the road for long. When it was over, Emeric walked the line of kneeling men with his hands in his coat pockets and crouched in front of the one who had been giving the orders. Tell Corwin the harbor was watching, he said almost gently. It was always watching. Then he stood and left them to Bastien, in a city that had been ready for them for exactly 1 day, the single day it had taken a dying woman to draw the map. When the last of it was done, Emeric stood in the falling snow outside Ambrose's house and let the cold rinse the night off his face, and Bastien came and stood beside him. It's finished, boss, Bastien said quietly, all of it. What's left of Kessler is pulling back to the passes tonight. Not quite all of it. Emmerich reached into his coat and drew out his mother's ring and turned it once, so the worn engraving caught the light of the dead man's porch lamp. Resta con me. Stay with me. Load their dead into Kessler's own rail car at the yard, he said. Send it up the mountain to Corwin, with the heat off and the doors open. Let him meet his investment at the station. He closed his hand. Then take me home. There's someone I promised I'd come back to. And for the first time in 12 years, it was not an empire he was driving home to guard. It was a person, a small, fierce, unkillable person who had loved his mother enough to spend her whole life keeping a promise to her, and who was, right then, sitting awake behind a bolted door, with a gun in her lap and her heart in her throat, listening for the sound of his car on the gravel. The gravel woke her. She had not slept, she had promised herself she wouldn't, and Lynette had kept harder promises than that, so she was already upright in the leather chair, the gun leveled at the study door, when she heard the car on the drive, then the front door, then the long, uneven weight of his tread in the hall. She knew it was him, but she kept the gun up anyway until his voice came low through the wood. Lynette, it's me. It's done. The breath went out of her, and it seemed to take a year with it. The bolt was stiff under her clumsy fingers. When the door finally swung wide, he filled it, snow melting in his dark hair, his coat marked with the night's work, and alive. He was alive. She let the gun sink into her lap and looked at him breathing, and something she had held rigid for 12 years. Quietly, finally, came apart. You knocked, she said. Her voice wobbled and she hated it. You could have just, you knocked. You told me to empty it into whoever came through that wasn't me. He crossed to her and went down on one knee before the chair, the way he'd knelt in the blood on Marrow Street. Didn't seem sporting to test you, Ambrose? Won't ever open another door. She closed her eyes. He watched 12 years move across her ruined face, not triumph, but something enormous, being set down at last, a weight she had carried so long, her body had forgotten. It was possible to stand without it. When she opened her eyes, they were wet, and this time she let it fall, one slow line through the bruises, and did not look away from him while it went. They were both there, she whispered. In the birches, your mother and mine. I've had them in my head for 12 years, saying, not yet, keep it safe. Her breath shook. It's the first time it has ever been quiet in there. Emmerich reached up and wiped the tear away with his thumb, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and the snow came down past the black window, and it was, for once, only snow. He carried her up to the warm room, when at last she couldn't hold her eyes open, laid her in the center of the wide bed, and sat on the floor beside it, with his back against the mattress and his mother's ring closed in his fist, keeping watch over the one thing left in the world he had not managed to lose. Near dawn he slept, sitting up, guarding her. The deepest sleep he'd had in 12 years. The call came at 8, a mountain exchange, Corwin Kessler's number. Emmerich took it at the window, black coffee going cold in his hand, Lynette, asleep behind him, with her fever broken and her face at peace, at last. He let it ring twice, then answered, and gave the old man his terms in 6 cold sentences. The wedding was dead. His harbor and his water were closed to the Kesslers, and if one freight car crossed his line, he would come up to the passes himself and take his time about it. You spent 12 years certain you'd put the boy from Hollamere to sleep, he finished. You woke him. Don't call this number again. Then he hung up before Corwin could find his voice, and stood watching the snow, and behind him the blankets stirred. Did you shoot the phone? Lynette's voice, rough with sleep, threaded across the room. He turned. She was pushing herself up against the headboard, blinking at the hard, bright morning, at the unfamiliar room, at him standing in the light in a clean white shirt. And then her eyes found the coffee in his hand and the set of his shoulders, and she understood that it was over, all of it. I handled it, he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. How do you feel? Like someone left me to bleed on a floor, And then a lunatic drove me across the city at 90. A flicker of the dry humor he was already learning to live for. Better, he laughed, a real one startled out of him. Then she cleared her throat and reached for the old armor she knew how to stand on. So, if the Kesslers are out, you lose the mountain freight. The passes reroute through the eastern yards, and you'll need to renegotiate the tariffs before the quarter closes. Linnet. He put his hand over hers on the blanket, and she stopped and looked at him. You have been awake for 4 minutes. I don't do well with resting, she said. A faint, real flush crept up under the bruises. If I stop, I have to think about. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. 12 years of not stopping, because stopping meant feeling the weight of what she carried. I know, Emeric said gently. I've spent 12 years the same way. We'll both be very bad at this, but we'll learn. Starting now. He turned her hand over in his palm, up the cold chapped palm that had held his mother's ring out to him in a room full of killers, and reached into his breast pocket. His mother's ring lay in his palm, worn thin and warm from 3 days against his heart. Linnet went very still. She told you to put it in my hand, Emeric said quietly. And you did. You kept a promise to a dying woman for 12 years, and it nearly cost you your life. His voice roughened. But she got one thing wrong. My mother. She thought the ring was for me. He lifted it. Look at it, Linnet. It's too small. It always was. I could never have worn it. I only needed it back. It was never mine. He took her hand. It was for the one who kept it safe. It was always going to be yours. I think that's what she meant by stay with me, not her. You're the one who stayed. 12 years, you stayed. You brought her home. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been sized for her in a snowbound orchard 12 years before. Linnet stared at his mother's ring on her own hand, the ring she had guarded in the dark for more than half her life, and never once imagined she was permitted to wear. Her whole face crumpled. The pragmatic walls, the 12 years of armor, the ghost she'd made of herself to survive, all of it came down at once, and she pressed her free hand over her mouth and wept the way a person weeps who taught herself long ago never to make a sound. Emeric gathered her carefully in against his chest, mindful of the stitches, and held her while she came apart, and did not once tell her to stop. I never wanted your empire, she got out, muffled against his shirt. Every one of those women wanted, and I only ever wanted to give it back and disappear. I had a bus ticket, Emeric. I was going to hand you the ring and be gone by morning. I know, he said into her hair. That's exactly why you're the only one who was ever going to get to stay. He drew back, just far enough to look at her, and took her bruised face in both his hands, the way his mother used to take his own. So burn the bus ticket. You don't sit at a desk outside my door. You don't live in the shadows. And you are done being no one. You take me up to Hollowmere in the spring, and teach me the birds, and you nag me about tariffs, until we're both old and you let somebody else do the carrying for the rest of your life. His thumbs moved over the tears. You've been hidden long enough, little Linnet. Hidden, not lost. You said it to me twice. Come and be found. Stand in the light with me. She looked at him a long moment, the winter man no woman had ever thawed, looking at her as though she were the only warm thing left on earth. And Linnet, who had chased nothing and asked for nothing, finally let herself want something. All right, she whispered, her fingers curling over the ring, holding it to her palm the way she'd held it for 12 years, except now it was hers. All right, Emeric. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He leaned in and pressed his mouth to her forehead and held it there a long time, a vow older than either of them, while the snow came down. Every woman who ever chased Emeric Vale wanted what he had. The one who caught him was the only one who came to give something back, expecting nothing, ready to vanish into the snow the moment it was done. That is the thing about the quiet ones, the ones the world teaches itself not to see. They are not weak, they are the strongest people in the room, right up until the day one of them crosses a crowded floor, presses your whole broken history into your hand and turns your life over with three soft words: hidden, not lost. Emeric Vale didn't just call off a wedding. He burned down the empire he'd built out of fear and put the last piece of his mother, where it had always belonged, on the hand of the invisible girl who carried her home. If a story about loyalty deeper than blood, where the quietest soul holds all the power, is what you're here for, you're on the right channel. Tap that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew who Lynette really was? I read everyone. I'll see you in the next story.